Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Excellent. I have an unfair advantage. I had a microphone. Good morning. Isn't it amazing to be here? I'm really privileged. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. As Susanna said, my name is James Perkins. I'm still remembering that after this long, so it's going quite well. I'm the Vice President for Education and have been for the last 2 years at City University London Students' Union. But just so you understand a bit about me, I was a music student beforehand, and for 2 of those years I served as a programme representative. For 1 of those years I was a school level representative, and for the last 2 years, because I'm slightly, either I love it or I'm a sadist, I've been a sabbatical officer, so a representative for 5 years now. And I'm really, really excited to be here and talking at a conference about students as partners. This is a shift in rhetoric around the higher education sector that's going on at the moment. I was recently at a conference in Newcastle around the idea of students as partners and student engagement, and it's amazing that we have this kind of conversation going on right now in the current climate that we sit in. But enough of that. What are we going to look at today? We're going to think about what partnership is and what it means. But we're also going to consider the role of power, because I think it's really important that we understand what power means in terms of effectively creating a partnership between universities and students, and also to put the student inside partnership. I think sometimes we can be guilty of forgetting that a partnership isn't just about the centre and staff, or students and staff. It's about everyone, and it also does include lots of different people. So let's really think about how we can get that going. And the rest of the session this morning will sort of give you some things to think about and hopefully set you up really positively for the rest of the day. So unfortunately, because I can't do a presentation without a technical glitch, my video isn't working. However, how many of you have ever seen the 2 Ronnies before? Just quick show of hands. Wonderful. So just to give you the gist of what the video would do, joke, 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 joke. It's good night from me. Good night. You're amazing. We're going to do that again because there wasn't quite enough energy. So it's good night from me. This omnipotence is going to be quite a power trip for me, I'm not going to lie. So, bearing that in mind, for the next few minutes, I'd like you to think about which famous duos stick in your mind and why. So talk to one of the people on your left or your right, whichever way you're inclined, and we'll sort of feed back in a couple of minutes. So please talk to each other, find out each other's names and duos that stick in your head. Okay. Let's wrap that up. It's time for the audience participation element of my presentation.
Now you know what it's like.
Roberta just said, now I know what it's like being a lecturer. People ask me why I'm leaving. Anyway, so let's go to the floor. Who wants to share their partnership and why they stick out in their mind? Go on, rush at once, I dare you. Amazing.
Abbott and Costello.
Abbott and Costello, why do they stick out?
Because they're the first ones I remembered.
Fair point. Was there anything particular about them?
They were very funny. One was sort of short, fat and ugly. The other was tall and handsome. And
Okay.
they were quite a sort of... They're quite contrasting in the way that they dealt with each other.
Okay, contrast. Short and fat, tall and handsome. I won't tell you which one I am, but I know which one you're all thinking. Okay, let's go to someone else. Thank you very much for that. Anyone else? Say again? Holmes and Watson, fantastic. I'll be coming on to them in a second. What was it about Holmes and Watson? One feeds off the other. Okay, different perspectives. That's great. That's a really good example. And you've nicked it from the rest of my slides, clearly. Dropbox is flawed. Who else? Another couple? Susan?
Clinton and Clinton, because you never quite know what is going on.
That's fair to say, yeah, Clinton and Clinton. Wow. I mean, they're one of the strangest partnerships. I always imagine that sort of if they ever lived in the same house, they'd have different wings. Very effective partnership. Wow, that's not the sort of model of marriage I'm looking for. Thank you for that. No. I'm just taking a life lesson. It's about me learning today as well as everyone else. And the final, one more, yeah? Patsy and Edwina? Okay, you're going to have to explain that one because that's gone straight over my head. Oh, absolutely fabulous. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I have actually seen that program. I'm not. Wow. Whew, crikey. All right. Okay. So thinking about those examples, what have we learned? Typically, partners aren't always partners, and if they're not always partners, they're probably not always equal. Let's go back to the first example. One of them was short and fat, and it's probably fair to assume that his tall, handsome friend hung around with his short, fat friend to make himself feel better. But think about that for a second. What does that say about how we position ourselves with others? What does it say about how we position ourselves with students? Not that students are short and fat. I'm a representative. I'll tell them if you say so. But actually, this idea of inequality is something really to sort of bear in mind and think about. There's always the fool guy, the stronger character or the clown. Typically in partnerships, there's this idea of complementation, but also the idea that one of them is sort of wouldn't necessarily work without the other person, but that's not to say that they're not as good as them. Typically, there's one character that sticks in your mind. Let's think of another famous duo. Well, let's take Morecambe and Wise for a second that I had on the other slide. Morecambe, very intelligent. Eric Wise, a little bit of a buffoon with an awful, awful wig. So, there's always that kind of thing going on. And what does this say about partnerships for students? Well, it says that we need to start thinking about how we position ourselves and what the balance is between partners. But in particular, the question we need to be asking ourselves is, have we gotten it wrong? And I'm going to argue that right now, generally, I don't think the sector has gotten it right. So, I'm a student, I've graduated, I know what plagiarism means, so I'm not using Wikipedia, I am using the Oxford Dictionary Online, which defines partnership as the state of being a partner or partners. Now, when I prepared this, I realised I probably should have found a definition for what a partner meant, but I didn't. Essentially, somebody working with someone else, I think, is probably the best thing to take. Secondly, an association of two or more people as partners. Great, we start to understand it's not just about one person or one individual. A business or firm owned or run by two or more partners. Well, that's interesting, there's a sense of ownership there. We can take that one forwards. A position as one of the partners in a business or firm, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're running anything. So actually maybe partnership is not necessarily about the fact that everyone's equal and doing everything together. Maybe it's about the fact that people are partners, there's still something at the top. Think about power. And finally, because I like cricket, this is also in the definition, the number of runs added by a pair of batsmen before one of them is dismissed or the innings ends. You might not think it's necessarily a good definition to use, but actually for our students, the innings ends when they graduate. And actually the effective partnerships are the number of runs they've scored, the way in which they've done it, and how people remember that. There are some, any of you are cricket fans, check out the highlights of the Ashes 2005. There are some incredible partnerships. And actually one of the good things about cricket is that when somebody scores a century, they can't do it without their partner supporting them and making the runs and giving them the ball to do so. So yeah, that was a bit of a stretch, wasn't it? Okay, you're going to have to indulge me now. I am a music graduate, so let's look at musical theatre for an example of what partnership could look like. So what parallels can we draw? Well, you could argue that musical theatre, particularly my favourite show, which is Les Mis, I won't sing for you, is a partnership between Claude Michel Schoenberg's music, Alan Boubel's lyrics, and Victor Hugo's text, working in partnership, creating something that was amazing and beautiful and creates emotion and creates drive and gets you through, and you come out of that show feeling amazing and good about yourself and forgetting that everyone at the end dies. But also maybe it's the partnership of the cast. Maybe it's the fact that actually the main character is supported by an ensemble, they're supported by secondary characters, tertiary characters, all these different people coming together and making one performance. I think that makes sense. Or, and this leads me on to my next slide, is it about the audience and the entire production? Is it about the fact that in this room you've got the stage, you've got the entire cast of Les Mis, you'll have to use your imagination, but you've also got the technical crew, you've got the people who do wardrobe, you've got the musicians, all working together to create something as a shared experience with a shared goal. But theatre brings me on to the fourth wall, which isn't, I must admit, it's not a concept I'm particularly au fait with. I didn't particularly study Chekhov too much, but I'm aware that he thought about it a lot. This idea that the fourth wall is the imaginary wall between what's going on the stage and what's going on in the audience. And theatre works with careful attention to thinking about the fourth wall. And when it's broken, it requires very careful attention to make sure that it works. If it doesn't, it can be really uncomfortable. How many of you have ever been to a pantomime and been brought on stage and had a custard pie thrown in your face? That's just me. Oh, no, there's another one. Solidarity, comrade. It can be a bit awkward. And some people, most people, and in fact 9 times out of 10, the people who don't like it are the ones who get called up on stage and covered in weird custard tasting foam. But in lectures, we break the fourth wall now. It's amazing. We've come from this place where lecturers now stand at the front. They don't just read off a script, they engage, they break it very carefully. And when it works, we call it discussion. We call it good pedagogy. But when it doesn't work, all the time I hear people calling it student fatigue. The students aren't interacting. The students aren't getting involved. So when it goes well, it's all because the lecturer's doing what they should be doing properly. It's not about the fact that students are engaging and they're encouraged to engage and they bring something to that lecture experience. But that comparison, does it seem particularly fair? Well, this brings me on to my next point. As well as being a music graduate, I'm an avid comic book fan. And so one of my favourite quotes is from Uncle Ben from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility, which encourages Peter Parker to become Spider-Man, to go out and save the world. But why is this important? Because in a higher education context, academics and people who work in the institution fundamentally hold the power. And people argue that this has shifted since the 9K regimes come in, that fees are increasing all the time and actually power's in the students' hands. But all you need to do is look at the thing that came out yesterday about the number of complaints that are going to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator now to realise that power is not in students' hands. And that's since £9,000 came in. So think about that. What does having the education, what does having the knowledge mean? It's a power imbalance. So, let's think about what examples of partnership that we have going on at City and how this works with power. We have representation structures and committees that David mentioned, programme representatives representing students in each course, sharing issues, concerns, having input on issues of quality and standards. We also have the broader student voice, how we engage students more generally, rather than just simply through representatives. We have surveys. At City, we run an internal survey for first and second year undergraduates called Your Voice, which talks about their experience and allows us to sort of build and enhance their programmes during the time that they're there. And before, something you may or may not have heard of called the National Student Survey, which I always like to think the acronym actually stands for Not Social Science, rather than National Student Survey. I've been doing this for 2 years now. The education puns will come through eventually. I'm really sorry. Also, you've got the postgraduate taught and research experience surveys run by the Higher Education Academy for subscribing institutions. Well, let's talk about how effective these are. So let's look at representation. A lot of the time, it's listening to some students. Based on experience and based on what students often tell me, there's still a bit of an issue sometimes where students aren't feeding into representatives. And so there's a little bit of an imbalance between how representation is working, which means that we're in a room and we're listening to some students, but we're maybe not listening to all students. We're letting them take part in conversations around academic standards, quality and enhancement, so they're actually getting involved in the good stuff, the interesting stuff, and sometimes the thing that's slightly harder to sell to them. But the question we have to ask is, are we really educating students to be equal in these conversations? I'm involved in a project at the moment with the Quality Assurance Agency and National Union of Students, which is essentially doing a bit of an audit about how representation is working at the moment. And what it turns out is that there's no confidence, really, about what students understand as academic quality and standards, how we as a students' union are engaging them in those conversations, and how they're supported within schools and programmes to be able to have those kinds of conversations. Does that reek of partnership? Well, how can you be equal if you don't have a shared knowledge base? It's also formative, which is the good thing about representation. The student voice, through reps, is carried on from meeting to meeting and issues are tracked, and it's one of these processes which is ongoing. But mentioning student voice, let's have a look at it slightly more broadly. So the student voice generally is listening to the views of all students, the majority of students, the people who get involved, respond to things like surveys, and taking their views on board. Thankfully, that's not necessarily the situation we're in at City, but sometimes you've got to wonder about whether or not the mechanisms we have in place are accountability clear. No, they're accountable mechanisms. And the reason I say this is because how often do we do them? Annually? NSS, Your Voice, PTES, biennially with PRES, or do we do them termly, module evaluations? These things are actually summative. It's one point where you're getting feedback, and actually it can be very difficult for those people sometimes to see how things move forwards. So are we actually approaching the student voice with partnership? Let's look at surveys. Surveys are a very predefined set of questions, a very difficult set of questions sometimes for people to answer. And often, they're not asking the questions that students may want to answer. I haven't yet talked to a student who went, actually, the NSS was really good. I felt like I was able to have all the say I wanted to about the things. Because there isn't questions about, a lot of people say that university is a learning experience, personally as much as anything else. But are we asking questions about how well supported students were to make colleagues, to make friends, to have social activities? We're not. The good thing about your voice, the internal survey you're on, is it does ask those kind of slightly more broad experiential surveys. And I've been hearing murmurings that there's a sort of group of people who want to bring in the experiential survey that the American institutions run, which I can't remember. What's it called? Is it the NESI? The National Experience Survey of something. Anyway, it's called the NESI. If you sort of try variations of the acronym, you'll find out what it means. But what do we do at City? So up until 2013, we had a campaign called You Say, We Listen, which, if you want to look at it, the actual phrase itself says that you're saying something and we're taking it in. We're taking your views on board. The title doesn't necessarily lend itself to the fact that we're doing something about it, although we do. And the institution is so good at responding to student feedback, it's just very difficult to explain to students sometimes the fact that what we did in year X has affected year Y, and you'll see the benefit of that in year Z and in your later life. In 2013-14, we launched Your Voice, Our Action. You say things, we're going to go and do stuff. Much, much better. Although, fundamentally speaking, that does imply that the university are the only people who need to do anything. Now, one of the difficult things to balance as a representative is you start to see both sides of the story being exposed to the university and to students. And I think it would be unfair to say that students don't have an active role to play in university and in higher education. But how do we do that? How do we support them? Well, let's have a look. I put this thing on here about consumerism winning. Sometimes it does feel like it's one of those surveys. Were you happy with your service today? Well, you might be happy with it today, but are you going to be happy about it tomorrow? How do you encourage that? So let's look at some of the things that we do and some of the marketing that we used for the campaign this year. Now, I should give you the caveat. I loved this campaign. It was amazing. However, let's look at some of the partnerships we used and sort of try and talk about some of the things that you could see if you're a student. So, Yoda and Luke. You are Yoda. You students, you are Yoda. Or Yoda, you are. And we are Luke, master student. Actually putting the power in the hands of the students. But completely different levels of understanding, and actually doesn't necessarily suggest that there is an equality there. And also, just to point out that if the students are Yoda, then they die. By the way, the rest of this presentation may well be a spoiler for a lot of sort of popular culture things, and I can only apologise, but we'll go through that journey together, and you can hit me afterwards. So yeah. Sorry, I've already ruined Les Mis for the Deputy Vice-Chancellor. I'll take you one day, David. You are Holmes, we are Watson, as was mentioned before. One of you, the student, is an intellectual god, and the other is somewhat of a trusted companion, but seen by this individual as a bit of an idiot, or someone without the real mental capacity to be able to think on the same level. Now, if any of you have seen BBC's Sherlock, you'd know that actually they complement each other really, really well. But there are, again, completely different levels of understanding, a different power, I keep on doing this, a different power dynamic, and of course, if any of you have sort of come across Sherlock Holmes, fundamentally, one of you dies, and again, it's the student. Now, this might be a little bit sort of nitpicky, but think about it. If I can think like that and I can look at these things for more than 30 seconds, then what kind of messages are we sending to students? Another one, the Hunger Games. Any of you seen the Hunger Games? Cool. Any of you read the Hunger Games? Exciting. One of you is a ruthless hunter, the student, who everyone wants to love forever. Now, in higher education, you could argue that everyone wants to love you as a student forever because you pay them. Or you could argue that it's because of your outstanding hunting capabilities, because we've all been at the end of our student loans without anything to eat. One of you can hide really well in camouflage. The institution, Peter. Sometimes students say that they feel the university can be invisible. It's not necessarily something we hear at City, but I'm not thinking about City, I'm thinking about broader here. And again, spoiler alert, you do end up together, but if any of you have read the books, you realised how messed up their relationship eventually becomes. So this is interesting. Now, my favourite example is Kick-Ass and Hit Girl. Now, have any of you seen Kick-Ass, the film, or read Kick-Ass, the book? Some of you have. This is going to be interesting for those of you who haven't. The student, Hit Girl, is an amazingly powerful 12-year-old girl who appears in the comic and the film for the first time saying, now I have edited this slightly, come on, you fluffy bunnies, show me what you've got. Which is an interesting way to look at how students talk about an institution. You could use it. And the university is a nerdy teenage boy with a few spots, which is a strange way to sort of frame yourself, isn't it? You bring a lot of destruction and you drag your parents into it. Well, actually, that's probably the best analogy I could use for higher education. If for nothing else than for my mother's bank account. But let's look at Wall-E and Eve, which I think is the best example of how you can look at partnership. Now, I'm not particularly familiar with the film because I fell asleep watching it, not because it's not good, but because it was just that time of evening. You learn from each other. There's mutual gain here. They're coming at it from different angles with different sort of expectations. Yes, Eve is the slightly more advanced partner, but actually they're both learning. They're both getting something from the relationship. And I might go and watch it to make sure if that example was true. But fundamentally speaking, what am I getting at? Education is about knowledge, and people who hold knowledge, we've seen through how history has evolved, are the people who have power. And on the whole, knowledge is shared through teaching and dissemination to our master's students and to our undergraduate students, and not necessarily by mutual work or working together to research things until you probably get to a PhD student. So you need to think carefully about how partnership could work not only at an undergraduate level or a master's level, but throughout an entire potential university student life. And also this thing here, transactional traditional education exists by means of breaking the fourth wall. Thank God we've gotten there, but often we call it modern and we call it exciting purely because we're using learning technology. We're using PowerPoint, we're using clickers. Is that really partnership? It's a step, but it's not the goal. So I think we need change. So what does change mean? Change means getting students to suspend their disbelief to the performance of education that we give them. Fundamentally speaking, there is always going to be an element of transactional sort of input on education. But we need to be able to get students to forget the ticket price and enjoy the show. Because actually, you don't come out of a film going, oh, well, that was £15 well spent. And some of you, if you do, it's a really weird way to look at cinema. But generally, if you come out of a film feeling like you've wasted £15, then it was a bad experience. You haven't bought into it. It hasn't benefited you. You've gone home feeling depressed, ashamed, and £15 worse off. So imagine how bad that could be if you've spent £27,000 on it. But also, for students to leave university and go into the world knowing that they played an active role in what was played out. As an audience member, you are active in watching and paying attention to what's going on in front of you and engaging with it, which is why I've got that if a tree falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sound if there isn't anyone else to hear it. Because what good is a higher education institution that no one is paying attention to and no one is even interested anymore? Universities used to be a public good, something that benefited the local community and had real impact. Our own institution's motto is to serve mankind. How are we doing that? How are we helping students? So how do we stop power shifts and power balances? Well, we look at students as equal partners. And actually, what I'll get onto in a second is that we don't just look at them as equal partners, but actually as compromise partners too. We look at them as producers of their own education. I don't have time to go into that, but if you want to know about students as partners, go and look at the University of Lincoln. They're doing this stuff, and it's so exciting. We should ask students to share their experiences and not just answer our questions, because actually, most of the time, we don't know the right question to ask, but by God, do the students have the right things to say. And we also redefine our educational aims and approaches. So how can you look at this? Well, there are two definitions that I'll use to look at what students as partners is, and this is sort of me wrapping up now. The Quality Assurance Agency see partnership as a coming together of different parties to work on a shared goal, and the focus is on the logistics of coping with a potential disagreement of values, perceptions, or experiences. A shared goal. Partnership has to be a shared goal. You're not going to get institutional partnership if it's a top-down approach. It doesn't work. You have to get everyone involved, students, staff, academics, professional services, whatever you need, get them all involved. And NUS see partnership in a slightly more radical and leftist sort of way, which I quite enjoy. They value it as collectivism and democratic representation, but ensuring that the concept of the collective also serves the goal of individual student empowerment. If education isn't enabling individuals to come out of it feeling that they've grown and that they're equal to the people they've just left, then we're not doing it right. There is this document, and I won't go through all this, but I will certainly make sure that I send out the slides, which covers a manifesto for partnership, which was a document by the NUS released, I think it was last year, either 2012 or 2013, which is amazing. It's not an action plan, it's a theory, but it's a theory that I'm excited by. Choose partnership and choose it as an institution and not a clique of management. Everyone getting involved makes any institutional target much more achievable, and partnership has to be one of those things. Invest in partnership. It takes time. You can't say, we're an institution that values partnership, and tomorrow you'll get there. It's not going to happen. Break down the barriers to partnership, and this is often to do with enabling people to spend the time to develop it, or enabling people to understand what it means. Knowledge is power. Set joint priorities for partnership. If you try and do everything you think you need to do to get partnership to be in place, it won't work, it'll crumble, it'll fall. And keep partnership under review. Once you've gotten to the stage where you feel you've achieved partnership in something, don't let it go. Monitor it, evaluate it, create policy around it, create focus groups around it, get students involved, get staff involved. A unilateral approach will make a whole lot of difference. So let's just round this off quickly. Students as partners and partnership generally is about engagement. It's about getting everyone in your institution involved in a joint mechanism, which is allowing students to be equal and valued members in your educational institution. But engagement is education, because we're engaging people in what they're learning, in their chosen subject materials, and getting out into the world of work. And education is therefore a partnership, because it's about sharing knowledge, it's about enabling everyone to have buy-in, and then to join it all off, partnership is engagement. Final thought before I leave. Partnership is relational. It's about understanding one another. It's about getting to know your students. And through the way in which you get to know them, they will get to know you. And that's really, really exciting. And that's what partnership should be about, understanding what an institution feels like, tastes like. If you go into my session later, we'll go into that in a bit more depth. Universities become communities of learning, of practice and enhancement. If partnership is what you're striving for and working towards, it'll happen. And relationships are compromises, and understanding what compromise means. So going back to this thing before, it's never going to be equal. Because if you have a student coming in a day one on a course and they know everything the academic's about to tell them, what's the point? But it's about understanding that sometimes you'll be giving 60% and students will be giving 40, and sometimes they'll be giving 70 and you'll be giving 30. But that's a compromise, and that's partnership, and that's me done. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.